Saving the wildlife is made possible by a grant from this station, which depends largely on viewer contributions. Please join us with your support.
Welcome to a celebration of life. Hello, I'm Loretta Swit. We're here to bring you a program about wildlife. Many of us fear that our world has become filled with environmental problems, but there are success stories, and those successes are what we'll focus on. All over the globe, there are people working to save our planet's most precious resource, life itself. We're going to bring you their stories from places as far away as India, Africa, Brazil, and China, and as close to home as Connecticut, Colorado, and Florida. Stories of people like you and me and my co-host, Mike Farrell.
Thanks, Loretta. You know, that's very true. And major strides are being made towards saving wildlife. They're the result of individuals who care enough to act on their concerns. We're going to take you on a round-the-world journey to see the truly life-saving work being done to protect endangered species. And you'll meet some real-life heroes who have dedicated their time and energies, often their entire lives, to the cause of saving wildlife.
You'll meet Jane Goodall, who has spent a lifetime with chimpanzees, Farley Mowat, author of Never Cry Wolf, Bridget Bardot, who lends her fame to the cause.
And share our exclusive visit with Britain's Prince Phillip.
It is really what public television does best, bring problems to the public's attention. It can bring the world into our homes.
Some of public television's most popular wildlife programming has been about tigers. These tigers are from the island of Sumatra, where only a few survive in the wild, perhaps no more than 600. These animals will lead long and healthy lives. Their keepers here at San Diego's Wild Animal Park will make sure of that. Every stage of these tigers' lives is monitored. Even the meat that they're eating is carefully chosen for them.
But in the wild, tigers have not always been getting what they need to survive. There were once 8 races of tigers in Asia, but 3 have already disappeared. In India, a unique approach to conservation could help save the remaining races of tigers from extinction. Tigers are the largest of all the cats, solitary, fearsome predators. PBS specials like Survival Anglia's magnificent Tiger have shown us their world as never before. The tiger's prowess as hunters won them access to almost all of Asia, from the jungles of India to the high mountain snows of Siberia. But today, tigers have surrendered almost all their ground to civilization. Only a few remain in scattered pockets of wilderness. Many of the last of these tigers survive in India, a nation at home in the modern world, but one that maintains its ancient ways. People have fought over India for centuries. Waves of Hindus, Muslims, and British. Each left its mark on the country. Today, 700 million people live here. By the year 2000, they will number a staggering 1 billion. To save the tiger from this invasion, India needed to find a way to balance the ancient world with the modern. For thousands of years, the tiger survived quietly in India's jungles. In 1900, perhaps 40,000 lived here. But studies done in the early 1970s revealed that less than 2,000 tigers remained. The decline had several causes. Huge tracts of wilderness lands home to the tiger were lost to agriculture. Jungles were harvested for forest products. The cow, a sacred animal to Indians, also added to the tiger's decline. Cattle outnumber people in India. In fact, 1 of every 5 cattle in the world live here, and they literally consume the jungles. Barren cattle lands cannot support the deer and other species which tigers depend on for food. Additionally, tigers fell victims to hunting and to the worldwide demand for furs and rugs. By the 1960s, the shrinking tiger population could no longer absorb these losses. Each year, fewer and fewer survived. The decline seemed irreversible. But some people were willing to fight for the tiger's survival. Kailash Sankala knew tigers from his early work as a forest ranger and later on as director of the Delhi Zoo. He and other concerned Indians proposed a series of measures to protect tigers. Beginning in 1968, the proposals became law. Hunting was banned. The tiger was listed as an endangered species. In 1972, an ambitious government project based on Sankala's recommendations was launched. Its aim, to establish preserves which would safeguard future generations of tigers. Its name, Project Tiger. But the land needed by tigers was often the same land used by villagers. Some were asked to make difficult sacrifices for the sake of conservation. They were asked to give the land they had farmed and grazed for generations back to the tiger.
In the jungle, there were no schools, no roads, no hospitals, and no means of communications. Nobody would marry our sons and daughters for these reasons. We were living just like the animals. Over here, we have relations and people of our own community. There are many more facilities here. There are schools for the children. The hospital is only 5 kilometers away. We have abandoned our land in the jungle for the sake of the tiger, so that his number may grow. We need land for the wild animals too.
But what about the tigers? Would they return to these lands so recently used by humans? In providing for tigers, vital natural ecosystems were saved as well. With plenty of prey and 15 special preserves to live in, the tiger population quickly increased to over 3,000. But as tigers increased, so have interactions with people. Villages next to the parks complained their cattle were killed by tigers. Park rangers complained that cattle wandered into the preserves. A way had to be found to keep village life and jungle life separate. Today, a series of inventive measures are being tested. Trenches built around the edges of the park discourage cattle from entering. Beefed-up park patrols watch the borders for cattle or villagers inside the park. Park staff and villagers agree that if cattle wander into the preserves, they are fair game. If tigers come out of the hills onto village land, the government will reimburse any damage they do. But the tigers must not be harmed. Today, India's parks attract tourists from around the world. The number of visitors to each park is limited. In return, people are given a more natural, more private wilderness experience. The park philosophy in India is unique. The main objective is the well-being of wildlife, not the entertainment of guests or the revenues from tourism. India's parks also offer historical monuments. High atop cliffs and tucked away in the jungle lie the remains of civilizations which have come and gone. Project Tiger began as an experiment in conservation. Its success has shown the way for other crowded countries. India has found a way to assure the future of its greatest predator. With continued care and commitment, the tiger will survive.
In the case of the tigers of India, it was a national effort that turned the tide. But in some cases, it's the work of a single dedicated person, like Marty Stauffer. You probably know Marty as the host of Wild America right here on public television.
It was Marty's film, The Man Who Loved Bears, that gave us a new view of grizzlies and alerted us to the threat they face in the Rocky Mountains of North America.
Some people don't have much use for grizzly bears. Personally, I like them. I think the grizzly bear probably, more than any other animal, is a symbol of the American wilderness. Beyond that, the grizzly bear is a barometer of a good, healthy ecosystem. Because any place that a grizzly can live, all other species could too.
I learned a lot about grizzly bears and their needs in the years that I raised Grizz. I got her from the zoo with the intention of raising her in the wild. When I first met Grizz, she was tiny and helpless. I felt a huge responsibility because I planned to reintroduce her into the mountains of Colorado. I had to teach her, as well as her mother would, how to be a grizzly bear. And in the process, I learned what it takes to be a grizzly. A lot of curiosity, even in a small bear. It takes intelligence and the ability to figure things out for yourself. It takes a sense of fun. I'd even say a sense of humor. And it takes courage, strength, and independence to be a grizzly bear. These are all qualities we respect, and in this way, grizzlies are really the kind of animal we should admire. For millennia, the grizzly bear lived and flourished in America. He was at home from the high mountains of the Rockies to the Pacific coast. But the white man, when he came, did not like bears. The first record of an explorer shooting a grizzly dates back to 1690. From that day on, the future of the grizzly bear in the lower 48 states has never been certain. California alone had about 10,000 grizzlies before settlers arrived. Today, in the entire lower 48 states, there are no more than 600 grizzlies left. They live in the high mountains of Montana, Wyoming, and Idaho. On national lands, like Yellowstone, they're protected. But in Montana, there is still a hunting season for grizzlies.
I have a big problem with the hunting season that they currently have in the state of Montana, and the reason for that is it's not based on any scientific or biological data. The primary reason for having the hunting season, in my opinion, is so that they can sell licenses and make money. And to me, that's not right. To me, if a species is going to be hunted, it should be because there is a surplus that can or should be harvested. And in the case of the grizzly in Montana, that's simply not true. When I first started making wildlife films, I did them just because I love to be out in the wilderness looking at the animals. And now I think that the more research I've done and the more that I've learned about problems, I really think that they've taken on more of a sense of urgency, more of a sense of importance in getting the message to people about how endangered some of these wild things and wild places are. To me, the loss or the extinction of grizzly bears in America, even in the lower 48, even if there's some left in Canada and Alaska, would be monumentally sad. I can't imagine Yellowstone or Montana without grizzly bears. And I think that we should cherish them and preserve them as certainly one of the most magnificent animals we have left, and definitely the most powerful and awe-inspiring.
This is a simulated rainforest. It represents an important but diminishing resource. In fact, the world is now losing an astonishing 50 acres of forests a minute to farming, ranching, and logging. At that rate, a third of the Earth's tropical forests will vanish in just 15 years. One of the many creatures who thrive on these living conditions is the golden lion tamarin. Until humans moved into their home in Brazil, tamarins were doing just fine. But the decline of the rainforest posed a real problem for the tamarin. Rio, a world away from the wilderness. Yet just outside the city lies the quiet of the Atlantic rainforest. The line between city and forest seems clear, but the explosive growth of Rio de Janeiro is eroding the wilderness at an alarming rate. The golden lion tamarin has lost 95% of its habitat to urban sprawl. Today, it is one of the most endangered monkeys on Earth. Less than 200 remain in the wild. Rainforests are the oldest and most complex ecosystems on Earth. Half of all species live there. The golden lion tamarin is only one creature threatened by their loss. Most of South America's rainforests are being lost to human encroachment. The primary threats are slash-and-burn agriculture and cattle ranching. But the economic gains from these efforts are short-lived. The soil of the tropics is so poor that within 10 years of human use, the rainforest has become wasteland. Half of all rainforests are already lost, and another 50 million acres are destroyed every year. Deforestation affects more than the wildlife. Farmers depend on the stable climate that forests provide. When trees are lost, a deadly cycle of drought and flood is born. The result for human beings can be famine. The race to save the rainforests is urgent. An $8 billion international campaign has been launched to slow the rate of destruction. One step that Brazil has taken is the formation of the Poço das Antas Biological Reserve outside Rio de Janeiro. Here, the golden lion tamarin is being given a second chance at survival. The monkeys are bred in captivity in places like Washington, D.C.'s National Zoo. From there, they're relocated to a special survival school in Brazil. They learn what foods to eat and what predators to avoid. Some have to learn to climb trees. After training, they're released into the reserve for life in the wild. Most of the monkeys released into Poço das Antas have survived the trials of the wild. Some zoo-bred females have already given birth. There will, it seems, be a new generation of golden lion tamarins at home in their natural habitat. Rainforests are essential to the survival of these beautiful monkeys, yet we all depend on their immense living wealth. They stabilize the global climate and provide us with a vast array of staple foods and modern medicines, including most of our cancer treatment drugs. Only a tiny portion of the Earth's rainforests have been explored, and less than 1% of the life within them has been tested for possible benefit to us. Yet experts predict that without immediate conservation measures, no rainforests will be left within 50 years. If we lose them, we'll also lose half of all species on Earth. So the need to save rainforests goes beyond providing homes for tamarins and other animals. Rainforests are vital to the health of our whole world. We cannot live without them. These chimps at the San Diego Zoo are second cousins of the golden lion tamarin. Actually, you and I are also related to these busy creatures, as chimps are our closest relatives among all the animals. Without the intense and sometimes dangerous wildlife studies of Dr. Jane Goodall, we would know far less than we do about chimpanzees. Jane Goodall has spent her entire adult life studying chimps. 1960, she came out to Gombe Stream on the shores of Lake Tanganyika to study chimpanzees. She had no formal training and no experience in living in the wild. Yet, over the next 25 years, she would discover and explore the world of chimpanzees.
I read books about animals from the time when I could first read, and gradually I got more and more fascinated by African animals because there seemed to be such a wonderful variety and so many of them. And eventually I saved up enough money to come out to Kenya and stay with a friend. I came out because I wanted to be with the animals, and I had a tremendous desire to learn about what they did and why they did it. And I didn't feel any constraints of the format I should collect the information in. And nor did I have any sort of violent rush to get it ready for a PhD dissertation. I just came to sit and wait and watch and learn. Sometimes I could hardly believe I was here. At the same time, although I loved to be here and I loved being in the forest and the animals and felt very much at home, there was always this tremendous worry that I wasn't habituating the chimpanzees quickly enough, that I was letting Louis Leakey down, so that there was a mixture of intense worry that I wouldn't do the job well enough and absolute delight at being where I'd always wanted to be.
For months, Goodall never saw a chimp at all. Then, for a year, she could not get closer than 100 meters. But finally, one male, whom she called David Greybeard, ventured into her world.
Gradually, because of David Greybeard, who allowed me to come close to him, David Greybeard, who came into my camp and took bananas, David Greybeard, who then came up to me out in the forest to see if I had a banana, with the other chimps watching with wide open eyes. Gradually, I was able to get closer and closer to them. I had a rocky peak up in the hills, and if I saw a group of chimps, I would move down to it, and they would let me come up close. So for the first time, I began to understand details of social behavior and interactions, rather than just piecing together movement patterns from my perch on the peak.
Jane Goodall was observing and recording animal behavior that had never been reported before. She was invited to make her first public presentation of her findings.
When I first heard that I had to give a major lecture in Geographic in Constitution Hall, I sat up on my peak and I prayed God I'd be gored by a buffalo, anything that I wouldn't have to face all those people, because I knew I couldn't speak in public. And it was quite strange how when the moment came, and not until the moment came, I found that indeed I could. And it was a very strange feeling how I was able to capture people's imagination. And this, I think, has been one of the most useful gifts that I was given, because I always used to say right from those very early days that if you want to help animals, whether it's to improve conditions in captivity or to help in conservation efforts, you must capture people's imagination. And if you don't do that, there's no point going out and spending 3 years studying an animal and writing in some fusty old journal that nobody's going to read. You're not going to help the animal one little tiny bit.
Jane Goodall captured the public's imagination, but she always returned to Gombe to learn more about the chimps.
I think the findings that have been most meaningful to me as an individual have been in relation to the very long-term, enduring, affectionate relationships between members of the chimpanzee family, that's mothers and their children. In some ways, the chimp mother is a model of how a human mother perhaps ought to be. At the same time, because a chimp family tends to spend a great deal of time on its own away from the rest of the group, you see that they're a superb model for some of the problems that we get as a result of nuclear families and single-parent families. And it's really fascinating. I only realized that a little while ago. You get neuroses developing because of over-dependency of the mother on her child. Well, we're not so very far separated from the rest of the animal kingdom as we once thought. Chimps have many of the attributes we used to think were peculiar to the human species. It gives us a better perspective. It makes us more humble. And at the same time, it makes us realize that we and we alone have the power to control the environment, and we have a tremendous responsibility to the other animals, to our own children of the future, and it's really up to us to do the best we can. When I first came to Gombe in 1960, chimp habitat stretched unbroken way out to the east, to some extent to the south, and also to the north. And today, the cultivation, the spread of human settlement has crept right up to the boundaries of the national park, which is a very tiny area of about 30 square miles. And now if you go along the lake shore, there you see the erosion from cultivating very steep rocky slopes, and then in the rains the topsoil washes off, and then it becomes very barren and inhospitable to agriculture and to chimps. And of course, in other parts of Africa and West Africa, it's far, far worse. They've not only had a shrinkage of their habitat, they've had a total loss of habitat and resultant extinction. "25 years has just taught me what I really want to learn. So the next 25 years is spent getting answers to questions that I really feel are terribly important. That's the great thing. Every single day you wake up thinking, I might learn something completely new. When I'm 70, 80, 90, still tottering around Gombe, I will be the grand old dame, I suppose. I've decided I have to live to be 105 in order to find out all that I need to know.
Jane Goodall, an inspiration to millions of viewers. After 25 years, she feels she is only halfway to her goal.
We've just begun telling you about the dedicated people who are saving the wildlife of our planet. We'll return with penguins, dolphins, eagles, the fight to preserve the Florida Everglades, and much more.
Welcome again to our celebration as we travel around the world to see the inspiring efforts being made to save wildlife. This is the penguin display area at SeaWorld in San Diego. Are there any animals so debonair and charming as our little friends here, always dressed in their tuxedos? While penguins, as cute and entertaining as they may be, have also come into conflict with humans. The issue for them is economics. Some people felt penguins were more valuable dead than alive. But one country found a way to give living, healthy penguins a very impressive value. To see how this was done, we go to Patagonia at the far southern reaches of Argentina.
Penguins live only in the southern hemisphere, but not all are found in Antarctica. Some inhabit tropical latitudes, although in cool waters. Penguins are unusual birds that cause scientists to wonder, for a time, what manner of animal they really are. As seen in this spectacular survival Anglia film footage, penguins don't fly in the air, but instead use their wings to fly underwater. They also leap over the waves like seals and dolphins. Their plumage is so dense that it resembles fur more than feathers. And on shore, penguins waddle around in an upright position, or else toboggan across the snow. Although it's tempting to dismiss penguins as comical animals, the truth is they live in some of the harshest conditions on Earth. Their lives are difficult and dangerous. They are one of the staple foods for predators like leopard seals and killer whales. Historically, penguins never faced predators on land, hence they do not fear people. But since humans first ventured into penguin territory, some have exploited this trust. In Punta Tombo, Argentina, over 1 million Magellanic penguins assemble to mate and raise their chicks, activities that have gone on here for ages. A plan by Japanese investors called for the slaughter of 400,000 penguins here, annually, to be killed for leather products and canned meat. When the government of Argentina began to consider the plan, the people of Buenos Aires turned out in the streets to demonstrate against it. Conservationists from the New York Zoological Society urged the government of Argentina to support a penguin watching business instead of a penguin slaughter. Today, tourism is a growing force in this wilderness area. Raiding is one of the largest industries of the province. People come from around the world to see the penguins of Punta Tombo. Argentina's conservation plan may pave the way for other species in the wild. Tourism is expected to be the world's largest business in the coming decades. Penguin watching and other natural history tourism could be a key to saving the wildlife around the world.
And so in Argentina, we see how a creative solution not only saves an animal, but also benefits the local economy. From penguins, we turn to a marvelous and mysterious creature who throughout history has captured our imagination. In the past 25 years, there's been a great deal of investigation on dolphins and their intelligence. Public television has brought you much of that story.
For diver and filmmaker Hardy Jones, television has been a way to teach people about dolphins, but it has also served to save the lives of thousands of these wonderful creatures. Jones is a wildlife filmmaker who specializes in the marine environment. His underwater documentaries, which have covered everything from sharks to manta rays, are seen regularly on public television.
The first thing that intrigued me about dolphins was their large brains. Some species have brains even larger than ours. They're also highly social creatures, and they have advanced sound and hearing abilities which allow them to communicate with one another. People had filmed dolphins many times, but never underwater over a long period. I wanted to try to really get to know a school of dolphins, to see how they used their intelligence in their own environment. Dolphins are as widespread in the water world as humans are on land. They live in every sea, and even some of the larger rivers. But they're extremely challenging to approach underwater. I tried for years and finally succeeded. But in my search, I saw not only the beauty of the dolphins' world, but also the horror. Dolphins have few natural predators, but in recent years, a deadly enemy has emerged for them in the form of man. As I studied dolphins, I learned of a small Japanese island called Iki, where villagers had slaughtered dolphins by the thousands. I went there to try and find out why. The fishing industry around Japan has been suffering for decades. The people of Iki Island blame dolphins for eating too many fish. But the real causes of the decline in the fishery are chemical pollution and overfishing. These pressures have destroyed a once thriving coastline. Today, hungry men and hungry dolphins converge on the few places where fish can still be found near Japan. It might be easy to hate the people of Iki for killing dolphins, but it would not be right. These are warm and friendly people. And while killing dolphins is not an effective solution, they do have a very real problem. Trying to show the fishermen that dolphins are special creatures, even demonstrating that dolphins are not responsible for the decline in their fish catch, was useless. In the end, the fishermen resorted to their own terrible solution. For me, the scene was one of unspeakable horror. The fishermen were in a carnival atmosphere. They had utterly no regard for the suffering of the dolphins. We were not able to save the dolphins in the face of the spearmen. All that we could do was film the gruesome scene so the world would know. Within hours, that film was on news programs around the world. Millions of people were outraged, and they flooded Japanese embassies around the world with protest. My experience at Iki showed me that some people simply do not realize that dolphins are thinking, feeling creatures. So I decided to try to bring out those qualities by filming dolphins in the open sea. From Japan, I went to the Bahamas and entered an entirely different dolphin world. For the next 7 years, working with my associate Julia Whitty, I filmed a program which later aired on public television, In the Kingdom of the Dolphin. Being with dolphins over such a long period of time enabled us to film things no one had ever even seen before. we learned that dolphins and sharks are not necessarily deadly enemies. Young dolphins sometimes gang up on large hammerhead sharks and have fun at the shark's expense. And we saw dolphins treat venomous stingrays with playful disdain. We even established a basic form of communication with the dolphins using sound and body mimicry. But most remarkable to me was the obvious desire of the dolphins to spend time with us. We never fed them. They came to us out of a sense of curiosity equal to our own. They seemed simply to want to play with us. After 8 summers in the Bahamas, I'm convinced dolphins are very special creatures, that they are perhaps not so different from us. They have brains very much like ours. They love their children. They're curious. My experience with them gave me a new sense of the world, a personal knowledge that there are creatures other than man who think and feel. I believe we should give them special treatment. In many countries, laws already exist prohibiting the killing of dolphins. But we should also protect their habitat and food sources. And of course, if we do that, we will also ensure a healthy ocean environment for human use.
Public pressure has been the greatest ally for dolphins. People have felt strongly enough to give dolphins legal protection in many parts of the world. We can only imagine how our lives will be enriched when these creatures are no longer threatened by us. Perhaps then we can begin to understand the mysteries of their society, their communication, and the secrets that must be stored behind those seemingly smiling faces. Now let's go over to Mike Farrell, who may have something up his sleeve.
Actually, Loretta, I have something on Dave's sleeve. This is Diana, a beautiful golden eagle. For most of us, the first introduction we get is a picture. And chances are that picture is in a book by Dr. Roger Torrey Peterson. He's done more to educate us about birds than anyone since James Audubon. He's also instrumental in saving their lives. We meet Dr. Peterson at his home and studio in Old Lyme, Connecticut. Over 50 years ago, Roger Torrey Peterson published his first field guide to the birds of North America. His paintings allowed people to recognize species at a glance. In the years since, thousands have learned to birdwatch using his method. And his guides have been dubbed the Birder's Bible.
The birds of prey are my favorites. Of course, the bald eagle is our national emblem. I've done it many times. This one, however, is done in a rather Audubon-esque manner, as Audubon might have done it. It's what I call delineation rather than painterly painting. It's a composite of many impressions. It's not like a photograph, because no photograph would quite give you what you have here. This makes use of what I know about bald eagles, past experience, whereas a photograph would reflect only that instant in time, that moment in time. I'm sure they breed more widely in Washington than we have it. We'll have to get information on that.
With his wife, Virginia, Peterson reviews the range maps for his newest guide. Changes in these maps indicate places where birds are thriving and where they're facing problems. Peterson's guides have done more than teach people to enjoy birds. They've helped create an informed public, which now understands the important part that birds play in our world.
Birds are far more than chickadees or cardinals to brighten the suburban garden. They are indicators, indicators of the environment. A sort of litmus of the environment. And when things are out of kilter, they reflect things rather quickly because they have a very high rate of metabolism. They lead a furious pace of life, and when things are not quite right, they show it before almost anything else.
Decades ago, bird watchers began to notice the mysterious, disturbing decline of the bald eagle and other birds of prey.
I was first aware that the bald eagle was in trouble when my friend Charles Broley was banding them in Florida during the war years. He noticed that something drastic was happening, that these eagles were not hatching their young. They were breaking their eggs by just their own weight. And he suspected DDT had something to do with it.
DDT, a chemical used by farmers to control pests in the fields, was considered harmless to other life. But in fact, it was polluting the environment of eagles and other raptors. DDT runoff from agricultural fields poisoned lakes and rivers. The toxins concentrated in the tissues of fish, primary food of eagles. Adult birds seemed healthy enough, but their young died, and the population plummeted. Other raptors, like peregrine falcons, faced similar ruin. When the effects of DDT and similar dangerous pesticides became known, Congress banned their use in the United States, and other conservation measures were taken. Endangered species were carefully raised in captivity, and then released into areas where they once lived. Today, nesting sites are protected by law. Stiff fines are handed down to anyone who harms an eagle or other bird of prey. As a result, some populations are beginning to recover. Eagles once again soar over states where they were wiped out only 20 years ago. In the 50 years that Roger Torrey Peterson has been painting, he's seen the beneficial effects of public awareness on the fate of birds. In his mind, the future holds even brighter promise.
There will come a day when I think most birds will become tame again, as they once were, before they knew how much of a predator man was. There must be at least 15 or 20 of these osprey poles that have been put up by the good people of Old Lyme and Old Saybrook, and most of them are occupied. And I think we could eventually even attract eagles to poles of that sort. You might call it management, but we've altered the landscape so much that a little management in the bird's direction is called for to correct the difficulties that we've made for the wildlife.
Dr. Peterson continues to paint, and today publishes field guides to birds all over the world. A tiny owl, newly discovered in the cloud forests of Peru, has been named in his honor. His lifetime interest in the world of birds has never faltered.
To me, any bird is exciting. Even a robin or a jay can do things that are interesting. So I find birds endlessly fascinating. Of course, I am obsessed. It's an obsession from which I've never freed myself.
Flamingos, like eagles, have also had a lot of ups and downs in their fortunes. In the United States, they can be found wild in only one place, the Florida Everglades. The Everglades are a rich biological system, and that whole system and all the life within was almost wiped out in this century. Until recently, we viewed the Everglades as the stuff of nightmares, dripping vines and deadly snakes, and as such, we fought to tame them with farms and cattle ranches. But today, that old image of the Everglades is changing.
Historically, South Florida has been underwater, although only a few inches. The Everglades system is one vast, shallow river that drains south from Lake Okeechobee into Florida Bay, a place the Indians called a river of grass. For eons, its quiet waters have sheltered a wealth of wildlife. But the greatest Everglades spectacle has always been birds. 100 years ago, over 2 million wading birds came here. When they rose in a flock, the sky was blackened. Each winter, herons, ibises, egrets, spoonbills arrive to feed on the rich waters of the Everglades system. But the modern world has changed the Everglades. Today, only a small fraction of the wading birds survive in South Florida. The problem is water. Miami is one of the fastest growing cities in America, and it takes water from the Everglades. Florida's rich agriculture and cattle industries also depend on Everglades water. Heavy demands on the Everglades lifeblood have taken their toll. In the early 1970s, severe droughts in the marshes led to raging wildfires. Animals and plants perished. During other years, when floods prevailed, excess water was dumped into the Everglades, drowning the wildlife. In a short time, more than 90% of South Florida's birds were wiped out. The alligator was almost extinct, and only 30 Florida panthers remained in the wild. An entire ecosystem was dying. Short-term measures were taken to help the Everglades, but a long-term strategy was not voiced until Florida's young governor, Bob Graham, turned the resources of his office toward the Everglades.
I was born in the Everglades. My father came from Michigan to South Florida after the First World War as an engineer with the sugarcane company, whose purpose was to ditch and drain and plant sugarcane on 100,000 acres of the Everglades. A lot of the bad decisions that we have made in the past were not malicious. They were ignorant. We didn't know what the consequences of actions were. For 100 years, we dammed and drained and diked the Everglades. Now we're beginning to see the Everglades for what they truly are, a unique system in the world, a system which sustains the very qualities that are required for life in South Florida.
Governor Graham, on behalf of all the Kissimmee Boudica directors, I want to welcome you to this area. And
Graham now uses the easygoing style that won him the governorship to undo the work of his father's generation with a conservation plan called Save Our Everglades. Although it's endorsed by the conservation world, it's the local cattle ranchers who need convincing. Their land may be subject to flooding under the new plan. Most of them see its necessity. The program will conserve water for people and wildlife alike.
Save the Everglades is an attempt to bring together private and public actions. It's a program which has an objective. By the year 2000, the Everglades will look and function more like they did in the year 1900 than they do in the mid-1980s. What we're doing here is installing the southernmost of 3 weirs into the Kissimmee River.
One of the first steps is to free up the Kissimmee River, which was harnessed into a canal 25 years ago.
The purpose of this is to force the water out of this artificial channel back into the natural floodplain. The end result of these 3 weirs will be to create 5 to 10 miles of usable river bottom and the restoration of almost 2,000 acres of wetlands.
Other steps in the Everglades plan include buying more land as a buffer zone for protection. Yet another urgent need is to save the Florida panther. Less than 30 of these magnificent predators remain in the wild. Their deadliest enemy is the automobile. Too many of the panthers left in Florida are being run over by cars. Save Our Everglades calls for cat crossings to be built into the roads. Without such protection, the panther is unlikely to survive. The Everglades National Park is also part of the plan. Once a victim of thoughtless water policies, the park now receives more natural water flows. Bird populations are improving, and the Florida alligator, protected from hunters, has rebounded. Today, the Everglades are a major tourist attraction in South Florida. Each year, 1 million people come to the park to photograph or simply to wonder at the serene beauty.
Public education is also important because it deals with the attitudes of the current and particularly the future generations of Floridians whose commitment to this new ethic, that is the only long-term assurance that this will not just be a passing fad.
Much of the Save Our Everglades plan is only in the proposal stage. Funding is still being sought. The need to balance development with preservation is urgent. The Everglades cannot afford more damage.
The Everglades are not just a treasure for Florida or for the United States. They've been recognized by the United Nations as one of the 8 biosphere preserves of the entire world. They are a unique system in a particularly vulnerable area.
Save Our Everglades is a vigorous first step toward preserving this treasure for future generations.
The Everglades are a perfect example of the chain of life and how our own survival is tied to nature. As Governor Graham has shown, a major link in the chain must be public awareness and belief that if the people know what's at stake, they will act.
In a moment, we'll be back with the Rhino Man, African warriors who have become conservationists, an exclusive interview with Prince Phillip, the Duke of Edinburgh, and the man who is helping to save the panda.
Hi, sweetheart. You're so beautiful. Look at those eyes.
There you go.
Do I get one? Huh?
If this looks like Africa to you, it's because it's supposed to. This is the African plain here at the San Diego Wild Animal Park.
And I know that this African rhino, Nanuki, looks rather awesome, but he's become so accustomed to people, he's actually very friendly. For the most part, rhinos live peacefully alongside human beings, even in the wild.
Which makes it all the more tragic that in recent years they've become the prey of poachers. And now this black rhino is the most endangered of all the large mammals.
To see how this problem is being attacked, we go to Kenya in East Africa.
Rhinos epitomize the wilderness of the African landscape. Over 1 million black rhino used to inhabit Africa. But since 1970, 90% of them have been slaughtered, as we've seen in Wolfgang Bayer's remarkable film, Rhino on the Run. Africa's human population doubles every 25 years, the fastest growth rate in the world. Cities like Nairobi attract people in search of a better lifestyle. But prosperity has not kept pace with population. Increasingly, Africans are born into a world with fewer resources. To a poor man, the rhinoceros is a promise of sudden wealth. Its horn is greatly valued in the Middle East and Asia. And that market for horn, thousands of miles away, is what is killing the last of Africa's black rhinos. Until recently, the trade in rhino horn was not well understood. But the work of Dr. Esmond Bradley Martin has revealed the traffic throughout the Middle and Far East.
I've been working on the international trade in rhino products since 1978, when I went up to North Yemen to look at the illegal movement of goods into that country. And I discovered that about 40% of all the rhino horn that was put on the world market in the 1970s was going to North Yemen to make dagger handles.
The other half of the trade takes place in Eastern Asia. Bradley Martin's work has shown that rhino horn is not used as an aphrodisiac, as was commonly believed. Instead, it is primarily used to lower fever. Despite its ancient use in traditional Asian medicine, the effects of rhino horn are purely mythological. It has no power to lower fever or perform any other healing function. Yet 2 countries still legally allow rhino horn imports. In South Korea and Singapore, the horn flows freely into the marketplace.
The World Wildlife Fund, with the assistance of the African Fund for Endangered Wildlife, has funded a year's project, of which I'm the director. The purpose of the project is to try to shut down the trade in rhino products in both Asia and in Africa, because no matter how successful we are on protecting rhinos in Africa with the very, very high prices for rhino horn, there's really no future for the rhino unless we lower the demand for its horn. And I think the only future for most black rhino populations would be to put them behind tall fences with electric wiring.
15 years ago, 20,000 rhinos lived in Kenya. Today, less than 500 survive. Faced with the extinction of such a visible animal, some countries are taking dramatic conservation steps. In Kenya, Dr. David Western, a wildlife ecologist with the New York Zoological Society, has been working to halt the rhino's decline.
The African black rhino has a very ancient history and is extremely important for today's conservation efforts for two reasons. Firstly, in Kenya, it is the symbol of our national parks. Secondly, it is perhaps the most endangered of all the large mammal species in Africa.
Until recently, anti-poaching patrols have been the primary weapon in the war to save rhinos. But as David Western tells, it's been a very difficult battle to win.
There are literally hundreds of tiny populations numbering 10, 15, 20 animals. When they're fragmented into these tiny populations, it means we have to allocate whatever anti-poaching forces we can muster over an area the size of Texas. But in the case of Nakuru National Park and Nairobi National Park, while being right on the doorstep of the cities, or perhaps because they're right on the doorstep of the cities, it's very difficult for poachers to walk in and help themselves to rhinos.
Kenya's Rhino Rescue Project is designed to consolidate the scattered populations of rhino. 4 national parks have been declared rhino sanctuaries. Over the next few years, outlying animals will be tranquilized and moved to the safety of these areas. Electric fences will be built to keep rhinos in and poachers out. The project is expected to cost over $2 million.
I believe that by targeting a number of rhinos we can contain, let's say 500 in Kenya, we can guarantee we will have enough for the next decade to feel confident we can rehabilitate them in the decades after that, when the demand for rhino horn should drop off.
In Kenya, conservation is a growing concern. Wildlife is seen as an integral part of the national heritage. An increasingly important ally of wildlife are wildlife clubs of Kenya. The clubs are formed of school children of all ages. Their purpose is to educate young Kenyans about wildlife and the strategies needed to conserve it. The teaching methods are practical, as in this case where students are taught the fundamentals of bird watching. An increasing number of Kenyan youth live in cities and have not grown up around the remarkable wildlife of their country. This song was specially composed to celebrate the life of the black rhino and the conservation efforts of another club member, Michael Warike, also known as the Rhino Man. He walked nearly 2,000 miles across Africa to raise money for rhino preservation. In the process, he alerted many Africans to the problems facing their wildlife.
Most people tend to, whenever they see me, and they stop me and say, how the rhino is doing. And I think that alone is a very strong positive reaction. Even the ordinary man in the street seems to be conscious of the problem now.
In Kenya today, there are over 700 wildlife clubs and 70,000 members. Their activities have led to Kenya's bans on hunting and wildlife trophies, measures which have substantially reduced the rate of poaching. Tourism is another powerful conservation force in Kenya. Today's tourists come to watch, not hunt, wildlife. And in East Africa, they find the greatest wildlife spectacle on earth. The revenues from tourism are the second largest source of foreign exchange in Kenya, another incentive for preserving wildlife. The combined efforts of scientists, students, concerned citizens, and government in Kenya have resulted in a far-reaching conservation policy. The Rhino Rescue Project will be closely watched by other nations. The survival of an ancient animal, the black rhino, hinges on Kenya's success.
Saving the wildlife is no easy task in a developing country, but remarkable progress is being made in Kenya.
Another factor which is important to preserving wildlife is the traditional lifestyles of local people. In the case of the Maasai tribe of Kenya, an imaginative plan has turned them into successful conservationists. The Maasai peoples of East Africa are best known to the outside world as cattle herders and as warriors. They have lived among wildlife for centuries, and until recently depended entirely on cattle for their livelihood. Maasai and their livestock migrated with the changing seasons, alongside the great herds of wildlife. The balance between man and nature was ancient and successful. But in this century, medical technology allowed the Maasai to greatly increase their cattle herds. With more livestock putting pressure on the habitat, wildlife began to decline. In an attempt to save the wilderness, Kenya began to found a series of national parks, but these excluded Maasai and their cattle. When faced with the loss of their livelihood, the Maasai took to spearing wildlife.
National parks in Africa today are really an alien concept, and nowhere exemplifies that problem more than Amboseli. In this area, a national park was set up in 1974, and in a sense what it did was to take away communal land from pastoral people, the Maasai. Amboseli illustrates the problem of a modern national park. The total ecosystem is 3,000 square miles. Because of human population pressures and land pressures, we could only acquire 150 for the national park. Well, here in Amboseli, we've tried a new experiment. We recognize that animals will continue and should continue to migrate beyond the national park boundaries. But in doing so, how can we make it in the interest of the landowners around Amboseli to accommodate those migrations? They are not willing to accept wild animals so long as it costs them, and it costs them dearly in terms of grazing every season. So the concept here really depends on one very simple premise. If the Maasai benefit from the migratory wildlife on their land, they will continue to accommodate it as they did in the past.
The first incentive given to the Maasai is to reimburse them for damage done to their cattle by the wildlife on their land. These payments ensure that wildlife can freely use Maasai lands. Without such insurance, wildlife numbers would decline through loss of habitat and through Maasai hunting. Tourist campsites and lodges have been relocated onto surrounding Maasai lands. This reduces human pressure inside the small parks, and it allows the Maasai to earn money from the tourist industry.
So the park has provided an exceptionally important employment for the Maasai as rangers, wardens, lodge staff, and so forth. And somewhere in the region of 30% of all families in this area now have some form of employment in the wildlife industry. In fact, the idea of conservation for sustainable development has become the new signal for national parks in general, that national parks should no longer be construed as anti-development, but should be seen as part of the natural development of third world countries. What hope is there for the future? Well, this scene is one I believe should never change. The Amboseli national parks of this world, I believe, are here to stay. Secondly, outside, I believe the population level will be lowered as people move to cities. And as they become more educated, I believe that that population will provide the Kenyan support that wildlife needs.
The struggle to save our wildlife is being waged around the world. The participants are often as diverse as the animal kingdom itself. From Maasai warriors in Kenya, we now switch to a man who grew up in completely different surroundings. An adventurer, a student of nature, and a committed conservationist. This man is president of the World Wildlife Fund International. You might also know him as the Duke of Edinburgh, Prince Phillip of Great Britain.
We travel to Banff in the Canadian Rockies, where His Royal Highness addressed the centennial of Canada's national parks.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, in 1985, there's nothing very original about the concept of national parks. But in 1885, it was a new and an unfamiliar idea.
One of Prince Philip's lifelong interests is wildlife. The first question we posed to him was, why save wildlife?
not always welcome.
You either believe in it, as it were, or you don't. It's a moral issue. There are various answers to it. You can have the selfish one that on the whole wildlife is nice to have around. That's one argument. There's the scientific argument that the wildlife, that's both plant and animal, is the culmination of millions of years of evolution, and we don't really know all there is to be known about it yet. There are an awful lot of species that we don't know about, so that you could argue that there is a scientific reason for not destroying it before you know what you've got. And I suppose there's the religious argument where you could say, well, we're all creations of the Almighty, and therefore what are we doing destroying part of his creation?
Prince Phillip is particularly concerned by the effects of an ever-growing human population on wildlife.
But the moment you start developing in a country where you're likely to disturb the ecology, you're already contributing to the problem. If your development then also creates an increase in the human population, you're causing an even bigger disturbance to the ecological problem. That's the point I was getting at. A great many of the areas of this world that used to have civilizations are now deserts. I think that the consequence of overpopulation is desertification, basically. What we really need is a gigantic Noah's Ark operation. Somehow or other, we've got to provide certain areas which are sanctuaries for what's left of the wild population, somehow or other, so that if we ever get to the point where the human population contracts and where people really begin to see the problem, then from those reservoirs, the wild populations can gradually move back out again. It's impossible, really, to achieve conservation of economically desirable creatures, or species, whether it's animals or plants, if there's a commercial demand for them. Because people will poach them, people will steal them. The difficulty is to get the message across. If you can combine it with some sort of self-interest, people are more likely to swallow it. We were talking about the imperatives. If you can say it's for future generations, people feel there's some point in it. If you say that you're saving it merely for the trees and the birds and the bees, or whatever it is, they think you're slightly dotty. But in fact, I mean, there is no justification, basically, in saving it merely for our benefit. And it really is for the world's benefit. I mean, it's for the whole living biosphere. It's for its benefit, of which we're part. I think it's not just the individual animal has a right to be there. Yes, I think that the species has a right to be there. I mean, it has evolved to this point. I think that we, I think morally, should not be responsible for making it extinct. If it becomes extinct for some other cause, some natural cause, that's too bad. But I don't think that we're morally justified in causing the extinction of our fellow creatures.
When we think of fellow creatures, some animals immediately strike an emotional chord in all of us. Such a fellow creature is the panda, which also happens to be the symbol for Prince Phillip's organization, the World Wildlife Fund. Both the fund and the New York Zoological Society have been working with the Chinese government to save the giant panda. Most giant pandas are found in the remote mountains of Sichuan province in China. Little is known about their lives in the wild. But in recent years, concern over their fate has increased. The bamboo which pandas depend upon for food was dying off, a natural event which occurs every few decades. But as a result, many pandas faced starvation. At the Bronx Zoo in New York, Dr. George Schaller, a zoologist who has studied pandas in the wild, described the attention the International Panda Project has received.
Chinese are extremely proud of their pandas, and they're perfectly capable of saving their own pandas. But the world attention that this whole problem has created has been a tremendous moral boost to the Chinese, for one thing. And number two, it has been a tremendous boost for conservation in general.
3 million years ago, pandas were found all over China and Burma. But the increase in human population drastically reduced their historical range. Today, only about 1,000 pandas survive in the mountains along the Tibetan Plateau.
Pandas obviously depend on bamboo, but then the problem comes. Bamboo is a very peculiar plant. Most species in China, they bloom at intervals and then die. Well, if that only happens, it wouldn't be such a big problem. But it's not just a few plants that die, it's all the plants, or 90% of them, over a whole mountain range will die. And suddenly, one day the panda's surrounded by food. A few months later, he's got at most a few little patches left.
In the past, pandas had alternatives when the bamboo began to die off. They would climb higher into the mountains or come down into the valleys. At each altitude, there were different species of bamboo available to them. But today, agriculture has destroyed much of this habitat. When the most recent die-off of bamboo began, the Chinese initiated a program to save as many starving pandas as they could find. But even as the pandas were being helped this time, a plan was needed for long-term conservation. In areas with only one species of bamboo, other types would have to be planted as reserves for future die-offs.
One problem is that the habitat continues to be destroyed, forests converted into fields, for example, and it's being increasingly fragmented. Little mountaintops with bamboo, not enough to support a population. But one measure that needs to be taken is there are still some large bamboo tracts which have no pandas. Perhaps they had them in the past. Well, those would be perfect for a reintroduction of pandas so one has more populations. Every environment has thousands and thousands of species, and by saving a panda, you automatically protect thousands of others.
It seems that ever since the Chinese sent Ling Ling and Sing Sing to the Washington Zoo, all America has been in love with the panda.
As we're seeing, scientists, political figures, filmmakers, even royalty are committed to informing the public about the threats to our environment and its wild creatures.
In our next segment, you'll see how an international star and sex symbol now dedicates her life to saving animals. You'll meet a man who never cries wolf, and we'll learn of efforts to save the giants of the animal world, elephants and whales. We've traveled so far to such places as India and Africa, Colorado, Florida, and Brazil. But there are many more destinations, and much more to celebrate as we salute the heroic efforts being made to save the wildlife. It might surprise some people to learn that international film star Bridget Bardot is also a passionate advocate of animal rights. In fact, she's only one of many famous people who use their celebrity status to focus the public's attention on the problems facing wildlife. For nearly 20 years, Bardot has lived this role daily in her hideaway at Saint-Tropez.
Bridget Bardot, Bardot. Bridget Bardot, Bardot.
French actress Bridget Bardot is still best known for her role as one of film's greatest celebrities, a superstar. But in fact, she has left the glitter behind as part of her commitment to saving animals.
My name is Bridget Bardot. I am well known, and I swear to use that fact to help stop these massacres. I would like to have seen Canada under different circumstances. but I have come from France not as a tourist, but because of the seal kills. The entire world, revolted by these massacres, seeks a solution.
Today, Bardot lives quietly on the French Riviera with her 8 dogs. They are her daily companions, and her love for them leads her to see all animals as friends.
I cannot stop thinking about animal suffering, but I try to be strong. The sun, the sea, the simple things of life, and my own happy animals give me the courage to return to the battle with animal torturers.
But for the past 10 years, Bardot has battled to save the lives of thousands of baby seals. Every spring, harp seals congregate on the ice off Canada's east coast to give birth. The newborn pups have translucent white coats, but to Canadian hunters, the pelts mean money. For years, they came out to the ice and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of helpless pups after birth. The fur was used for toys, fur coats, and for winter boots. But many people felt the kill to be frivolous and a threat to the survival of the seal species. Greenpeace, a non-violent group of activists, brought Bardot out to meet the seals and to lobby in their behalf.
That's a seal pup. That's what they kill by the hundreds of thousands for their fur. These wonderful, delightful, trusting little creatures. These furry little babies are killed to make furry toys, fur coats for stupid women to wear. We'll get them.
And get 'em she did. When Bardot spoke against fur coats, a woman who epitomized glamour and beauty, the world listened. She lobbied hard, meeting with ministers of the European Economic Community. She asked them to ban the imports of baby seal pelts. Her name was used to collect thousands of signatures from Europeans who demanded an end to the kill. Under intense pressure, the European Economic Community banned the import of white harp seal furs for 2 years in 1983. In 1985, they extended the ban for another 4 years. That year, the hunters did not go out to the ice. There was no market left for the pelts, and the baby seals were left to live.
Animals are to be loved, to be protected by man, because he's stronger than they are. I see my future with animals, because I shall always try to love and protect them as best as I can. Looking back, I feel that life is always worthwhile. Mine certainly will have been if I can do something for animals. I will not have lived in vain if I can say, because of me, animals now suffer less.
Farley Mowat's work is also known to film audiences. His story was told in the adaptation of his book, Never Cry Wolf. It was Mowat who gave us new insight into one of the world's most misunderstood animals. This is Kibu, a wolf from the woods of British Columbia. To find out more about Kibu and his kind, we visited Farley Mowat at his home in the Nova Scotia countryside. And we learned that wolves are a far cry from the myths about them.
400 or 500 years ago, when Europeans first arrived on this continent, the wolf, in many, many varieties, something like 14 subspecies, was everywhere. And it wasn't considered a threat, and it wasn't something to be attacked and destroyed by early men. It didn't compete with them, and they accepted its presence. They didn't even fear it. In fact, there are stories of early explorers walking through the woods unarmed and meeting whole families of wolves.
Mowat became a writer after a unique sequence of events which began with his life as a soldier.
It began for me with the Second World War. Prior to the war, I was bound and determined to be a biologist. I was heading in that direction until the war came. And I spent 4 years overseas, most of it in the infantry. And when I came back from the war, I wanted to get to hell away from my own species.
The story of Mowat's life after the war is what Never Cry Wolf is all about. In these scenes from the film, actor Charles Martin Smith plays a dramatized version of the young Mowat. Mowat was sent to the Canadian Arctic as a field biologist to study the effects of wolves on the caribou herds.
So I went to the Arctic, and my observations led me into closer and closer relationships. Not really relationships, but understanding anyway, of the animals that were around me. The wolves particularly fascinated me because I was able to achieve some understanding of them as brothers and sisters, as relations. When I first arrived in the country, I never saw wolves at all. They were there. The Inuit would see them and would tell me that they'd been there. I'd see their tracks. But the wolves were outside my vision. As I became more aware of the intricacies of the world they lived in, they began to appear. Wolves are essentially tribal animals. The tribe means more to them than the individual. Within the tribe, all of the individuals contribute to the general survival of the group. They displayed practically all of the better aspects that we see in ourselves. They displayed affection, they displayed playfulness. They were extraordinarily curious. Once they'd established in their own minds and in the tribal mind that I was not a threat to them, then their curiosity about me became as intense as my curiosity about them.
But most people have not been so fascinated by the wolf's intense curiosity. Early settlers were frightened by wolves who would stare at them from the glare of campfires. Bounties were placed on wolf hides. In 1915, the U.S. government allocated funds for the elimination of all wolves on federal lands, including national parks. Over the next quarter century, almost 25,000 wolves were killed, effectively wiping them out in the lower 48 states.
Right now, in Manitoba, at least in Alberta, the Yukon Territory, British Columbia, Alaska, there is a concerted effort to effectively eliminate the wolf populations. And it's the last place in North America, by the way, where there is a reasonably large, reasonably self-sustaining and vital population of wolves left.
The pressure to kill wolves today comes from hunters who fear that wolves decimate deer and caribou herds. But as Mowat and others discovered, the wolf is an important player in a natural balance between predator and prey.
The wolf plays an absolutely vital role as a control factor in wildlife populations, because the animals they are taking are the ones that are least fitted for survival. They cull the herds and keep the herds healthy.
Since Mowat's Arctic study, people have begun to reevaluate the wolf, to see it not as a killer, not as a threat to humans, but as an intelligent species with a key role in the natural order. Today, wolf killing raises protest from people who read Mowat's books and share his feelings about wolves. Farley Mowat believes the world would be better with wolves in it, better for wildlife and richer for us.
But it wasn't really until I stopped making notes that I began to understand them. It wasn't until then that I began to see with a different eye, an inner eye. And then the barriers began to really dissolve. And I finished up with an empathy for them. You know, if I said this 15 years ago or 20 years ago, it would sound embarrassing. No, I don't feel any embarrassment about it because there's a change in human attitudes. But it was almost as if I was reestablishing a living connection with my fellows. Different from me in appearance, different from me in many ways, but they were my fellows.
Farley Mowat reveals to us all the relationships that can evolve between wolves and humans when the threats are removed. Our next story shows another animal that seems well suited to friendship with us.
Ada, we have a little goodie for you.
Crunch.
Like wolves, like us, elephants are social, intelligent, and curious. All the qualities that make for interesting companionship, even in the wild. Throughout Africa and Asia, elephants have proven that when treated respectfully, they can be remarkably trusting and gentle. Elephants are the largest of all land animals. Traditionally, they've been found across the African continent and throughout Asia. But in recent years, the number of wild elephants and the places they can be found have declined on both continents. In the wild, elephants live in tight family groups, matriarchies, centered around an old and experienced female. Her sisters, daughters, and their children make up the rest of the group. The adult males are more solitary. The huge brains of elephants allow for their intricate social lives and remarkable memories. Elephant families have distinct cultures which are transmitted from one generation to the next. In India, the relationship between man and elephant is ancient. Mahouts, or elephant trainers, have a lifelong partnership with one animal based on mutual respect. In return for the elephant's labor, the mahout provides food and a daily bath. Today, elephants have become partners in the conservation forces of India. Elephants allow rangers to patrol the deepest jungle where no roads exist, and they move quietly through the bush without disturbing wildlife. Among Asian elephants, the females have no tusks, so these elephants have not, as their African counterparts, suffered greatly from the ivory trade. Instead, Asian elephants continued to decline due to loss of suitable habitat from human population growth. The African elephant differs from the Asian in several ways. It is larger, with bigger tusks. It is also far more difficult to train and does not traditionally have a working relationship with people. Nevertheless, one researcher, Dr. Ian Douglas Hamilton, has been able to get remarkably close to some wild elephants in the course of his studies. The number of African elephants, like that of Asian elephants, has declined sharply in the past 15 years. Historically, they roamed in the millions across Africa. Today, only a fraction of these animals remain. They, too, are losing an increasing amount of their habitat to human encroachment. But by far, the greatest threat comes from the international ivory trade. 1,000 tons of ivory leave Africa every year, the tusks of 90,000 dead elephants. International law attempts to regulate this slaughter, but Japan and Hong Kong, the largest buyers of ivory, conduct much of that trade illegally. The last hope for elephants in Africa lies within those national parks which can effectively prevent poaching. If protection is not given, then elephants will continue to decline in numbers and range. But if we can assure elephants enough land and protection from guns, they will survive as they always have, magnificent symbols of the wild.
While elephants have the largest bodies and brains of any creature on land, that distinction in the sea is held by the whales. This is Shamu, and he is an 11-year-old male and weighs 5,000 pounds. So perhaps it is fitting that the biggest success story in the fight to save the wildlife should involve this mammal of epic proportions. Right? Huh?
Since early times, people have been awed and frightened by whales. Sailors believed they were monsters. Whalers brought back tales of their huge size and their ferocious rages. But in this century, the fear of whales changed to wonder. The great whales are the largest creatures ever to have lived on Earth, far larger than any of the dinosaurs. Yet despite their size, Aristotle noted that whales and dolphins breathe air, nurse their young with milk, and have great affection for family members. More than 2,000 years after Aristotle, the study of whales is still in its infancy. Science has long been eclipsed by the whaling industry and the destruction it wrought. One species after another was targeted by whales in the quest for baleen and blubber. The easiest to kill, like the right whale, were the first to go. When they became rare, the larger and more aggressive sperm whale was taken. Last to be exploited were the huge blue and finback whales, which fell prey to faster boats and the invention of the harpoon cannon. In the late 1960s, scientists began to study the little-known sounds of the humpback whales. The vocalizations were haunting, beautiful, and when the first underwater film images aired on television, the love affair with whales was born. Along with the discovery that whale sounds were the most complex in the animal kingdom, scientists discovered the size and structure of their brains. Whales, it seemed, possess a real intelligence. But the more intriguing whales became to the public, the more images of the hunt seemed unacceptable. Just as the world learned of the wonders of whales, it also learned that some species were almost extinct from centuries of hunting. It was a race against the clock to save the whales. Growing public pressure forced one country after another to give up whaling. Urged on by scientists and by the public, the International Whaling Commission banned all commercial whale hunting as of 1986. The end to whaling seemed in sight. Yet the IWC has no power to enforce its laws. As a result, over 5,000 whales will still be killed annually for sale in Japan. Only the United States can force Japan to comply with IWC regulations through laws which severely penalize the profitable Japanese fishing industry if they violate the whaling ban. Some whales have already rebounded as a result of protection. The California gray whale made a remarkable comeback in just a few years. Today its population is healthy, and its return has fueled the birth of an entirely new industry, whale watching. Whale watching has also sprung up around humpback whales. In Hawaii, off the East Coast, Mexico, Alaska, virtually anywhere there is a growing population of whales. No longer threatened by us, some whales have initiated an awe-inspiring relationship. Saving the whales has been a model conservation success story. Scientists collected the facts about declining whale populations. An informed public responded with an outpouring of love and concern. The combined effort has given new life to whales. We have, it seems, been given a second chance.
We've traveled around the world to see the dramatic work being done by nations, organizations, and individuals to save the wildlife of our fragile planet. We've seen the beauty and the majesty of some of these wild creatures. We've seen the serious dangers facing them and their rapidly shrinking habitats.
And we've seen that it is impossible to separate efforts to save the wildlife from efforts to ensure our own survival. The people who are studying nature aren't merely doing it to compile statistics or write books for their colleagues. They've dedicated their lives to ensuring the future of our world as we know it. They're beginning to understand that we are the cause of many of the complex problems threatening wildlife, and that the solutions to these problems lie within our grasp.
No single program or even a weekly television series can sum up what's happening to wildlife everywhere. But public awareness is a key to conservation. We hope that we've made a start with the few glimpses we've given you in this program. This station will bring you as much of the story as it can, as thoroughly as the funds you provide will allow.
Thanks for being with us.
Saving the Wildlife was made possible by a grant from this station, which depends largely on viewer contributions. Please join us with your support.